The paycheck stopped coming before the war did. That is the sentence spreading through Russian factory towns right now, and it is the sentence Vladimir Putin does not want translated into English. Nearly 199,000 workers across Russia's industrial base have now been formally marked for dismissal, put on forced part-time schedules, or quietly pushed out the door entirely, and that number is still climbing, not in some abstract future recession. Right now, in the summer of 2026, while state television keeps repeating that the economy is stable, it isn't. Behind the studio, lights. Behind the parades and the medals, Russian industry is shedding workers the way a ship sheds cargo when it's taking on water. And Putin is doing what he always does when the numbers turn against him. He's pretending not to notice. Let's start with the simple mechanics of what is actually happening, because the scale of this only makes sense once you see how many separate craps are opening at the same time. Russia's Federal Labor and Employment Service, known as Rostrud, keeps a running tally of employees officially recommended for dismissal by their own employers. As of April 1st of this year, that number stood at 105,147 people. A month earlier, it was 104,775. In February, it was 100,397. Go back to June of last year, and the figure was only 73,572. Do the math, and you get a workforce marked for the exit growing by 43% in just 10 months, according to reporting from Vedomosti. That is only the workers who show up in the official government registry, the ones whose companies bothered to file the paperwork. It says nothing about the hundreds of thousands more who have been quietly shifted onto reduced hours, corporate leave, or unpaid furlough, categories that let a company technically avoid the word layoff while doing exactly the same thing to a family's income. When you start stacking those categories together across the auto plants, the railways, the metal sector, and the regional state payrolls that Moscow itself is now cutting, you land somewhere in the range of 199,000 Russian workers who have effectively been abandoned by the system that promised to protect them. Before we can go further, it is worth pausing on how strange this looks from the outside, because Russia is supposed to have the opposite problem. For years now, the headline number coming out of Moscow has been an unemployment rate hovering around 2.1%, technically one of the lowest in the world. If you only looked at that single statistic, you would assume Russian workers have never had it better. That illusion is exactly why this story matters, and exactly why it has been so easy for the Kremlin to hide behind it. A country can have almost no unemployed people and still be shedding jobs violently if those people are being pushed out of stable, well-paid industrial work and into something worse. That is precisely what is happening. The headline hire rate on Russia's largest recruitment platform, the HH Index, is a measure of how many applicants are chasing each open position. A year ago, it sat at 5.9. By March of this year, it had climbed to 11.4. That means competition for jobs has nearly doubled in 12 months, even as the official unemployment rate barely moved. People are not vanishing from the workforce. They're being pushed sideways out of factories and onto that overcrowded job platform, all fighting over a shrinking pool of decent openings. If this is the kind of on-the-ground economic reality you want broken down clearly, this is exactly the channel for it. So take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's coming in the back half of this video is where the numbers get genuinely brutal. Now let's go sector by sector, because the layoffs are not scattered randomly. They are concentrated in the exact industries that were supposed to be Russia's pride. Start with the automotive sector, because nothing captures the collapse better than Avtovaz, the maker of the Lada, Russia's most iconic domestic car brand, and the closest thing the country has to a national industrial symbol. For most of the war, Avtovaz resisted mass layoffs, choosing instead to furlough workers and cut hours to keep official statistics looking clean. That strategy has now run out of road. The company slashed its own production target for the year from 500,000 vehicles down to roughly 300,000, a cut of nearly 40%, because unsold Ladas were piling up in warehouses faster than dealers could move them. In March of this year, while the overall Russian new car market actually grew by 31% thanks to a flood of Chinese brands, Lada sales fell by 17.4%, making Avtovaz the only major player in the entire market that failed to benefit from the recovery happening around it. Employees at the flagship Tolyatti plant have been sent on so-called corporate leave, officially described as time off for modernization of the production lines. The real reason, according to intelligence assessments from Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, is that the warehouses are simply overflowing, and there is nowhere left to put the cars nobody wants to buy. Skilled technicians, men who spent years mastering precision stamping and assembly work, are now being quietly reassigned to sweeping workshop floors, cleaning basements, and repairing conveyor belts, just to keep them technically employed without paying them to build cars that won't sell. Avtovaz is not alone. Gaz, the country's other major automaker, shifted its entire workforce onto a 4-day week back in July, and employee incomes there have fallen by roughly 20% as a direct result, according to reporting from Mesh. KAMAZ, Russia's dominant truck manufacturer and a company whose vehicles have hauled equipment to the front line since the war began, followed the same path starting June 1st of this year, its second forced move to a shortened week in as many years. The financial picture behind that decision is ugly. KAMAZ posted a sales loss of $284 million for all of 2025, compared with an $11.3 million profit the year before, and in March, the credit rating agency ACRA downgraded the company from AA to A, citing declining profitability and a weakening ability to service its own debt. Heavy truck sales across Russia fell by roughly 40% in the first 2 months of this year compared to the same period last year, and KAMAZ's own management is no longer even talking about turning a profit in 2026. The stated goal now is simply to break even. Meanwhile, Chinese manufacturers like FAW and Citrek have already grabbed 21% of the heavy-duty truck segment that KAMAZ used to dominate almost entirely. And in the medium-duty segment, Chinese brands JAC, Dongfeng, and Photon now control roughly a fifth of the market between them, undercutting Russian trucks on both price and features. Some of the human detail behind these numbers is worth pausing on too, because statistics alone don't capture what it actually feels like on the shop floor. Reporting on Avtovaz's earlier rounds of restructuring described workers being offered buyout packages worth around 200,000 rubles, under $3,300 at the exchange rate of the time, roughly half the average annual income in Russia, in exchange for simply walking away. For a technician with a decade of stamping shop experience, that is not a severance package. That is a quiet request to disappear without triggering an official layoff statistic. Multiply that single story across dozens of plants and dozens of towns built entirely around one factory, the way Tolyatti was built around Avtovaz, and you start to understand why local officials are so nervous. These are not diversified economies with multiple employers to absorb the shock. They are single industry towns where the factory gate is effectively the only door to a stable income, and when that door starts closing, there's nowhere else in town for those workers to go. Here's the pattern we're sitting with for a second. Every one of these companies is choosing the same quiet strategy. Nobody wants to announce mass layoffs on state television because that would contradict the narrative that the war economy is thriving. So instead, they cut hours, they cut overtime, they cut bonuses, and they let workers bleed out through resignation rather than dismissal. At Avtovaz, the shift to reduced schedules eliminated overtime and bonus pay, cutting take-home pay by nearly half for some employees. Many of those workers have already quit on their own, according to reporting from the Moscow Times, drifting instead into taxi driving, delivery work, or the defense sector, where wages remain artificially propped up by the state. That last detail matters enormously because it tells you something the Kremlin desperately does not want said out loud. Russia's civilian industrial economy is not simply struggling. It is being cannibalized by its own war machine, as workers, capital, and government attention all get funneled toward weapons production while everything else quietly starves. And that cannibalization shows up everywhere once you start looking for it. Take Russian railways, the state-owned backbone of the entire country's logistics network, responsible for moving everything from grain to troops to industrial components across 11 time zones. The company has announced plans to cut 15% of its staff during 2026, roughly 6,000 jobs. Sounds almost modest compared to the auto sector, until you understand what Russian railways actually represents. This is not some struggling private business. This is a state monopoly, a company the Kremlin treats as untouchable infrastructure, the literal circulatory system of the war economy. When an institution like that starts trimming its workforce, it is not responding to a temporary dip in demand. It is responding to a structural funding problem that has made even the untouchable parts of the Russian state apparatus expendable. The metal sector tells a similarly grim story. Rusal, the aluminum giant and one of Russia's flagship industrial exporters, has been shutting down key facilities one after another. On January 1st of this year, the company's Kremny plant in the Irkutsk region, which was the largest silicon production facility in the entire country, simply stopped production. Several of Rusal's other factories have shifted onto reduced working weeks in the months since, and it isn't just Rusal. Russia's primary tank manufacturer, the company literally responsible for keeping Russian armor rolling off the line and into Ukraine, began mass layoffs in November of last year, citing both sanctions and what officials openly described as worker exhaustion. Think about what it means for the tank factory itself to be laying people off in the middle of an active war. That is not a company managing a slow quarter. That is a company that has run out of parts, run out of money, or run out of both. And it happens to be one of the most strategically important factories Russia has. Zoom out from any single company, and the national picture gets even starker. Rosstat's own data shows that layoffs across the fourth quarter of last year jumped 59% year on year, with organizations outside the small and medium business category dismissing 32,600 employees compared to 2,500 during the same period the year before. Wage arrears, meaning money workers are legally owed but simply haven't been paid, rose 2.3 times over, reaching the highest level recorded since 2016, north of 2 billion rubles. Nearly 14,700 workers went without their wages entirely at some point, almost double the 6,500 affected the year before. Companies routinely blame the central bank's punishing interest rates and the broader economic slowdown, and for once, that excuse happens to be accurate. Here's a number that should genuinely alarm anyone still buying the Kremlin's story of resilience. According to the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, an institution close enough to the government that its own chairman's brother is Russia's defense minister, companies across the country are now spending an average of 37% of their pre-tax profits just to service interest payments on bank loans. In some sectors, it is far worse than average. In railroad, shipbuilding, and aircraft manufacturing, interest payments now exceed total profits by a factor of 8. In wood processing, construction, and commercial services, the multiple runs between 4 and 6 times profit. In chemicals and automotive manufacturing, interest costs eat more than 3 times what the companies actually earn. Even in retail, traditionally one of the more resilient sectors, the ratio sits at 2.3 times profit. When the cost of simply servicing debt outpaces the revenue a business generates by a factor of 8, that business is not managing a downturn. It is functionally insolvent, propped up only by continued access to credit that itself is becoming harder to obtain. If you want to understand why this is happening now, in the summer of 2026, rather than at some earlier or later point in the war, the answer traces back to the central bank's own monetary policy. Facing runaway inflation driven by war spending, the Bank of Russia pushed its key interest rate to a record 21% in late 2024 and held it near punishing highs through most of 2025 before beginning a cautious series of cuts. That rate hike did what it was designed to do. It cooled inflation. But it also made borrowing catastrophically expensive for exactly the civilian companies that were already struggling to compete with cheaper Chinese imports and a workforce being drained by military recruitment. Russia essentially chose to fight inflation by strangling its own private sector, and the layoff numbers we're describing are the visible casualties of that choice. Before we go further into just how deep this hole gets, if you're finding this kind of detailed economic breakdown useful, drop a comment letting us know which sector surprised you most, because the next section covers something even the Kremlin's own statisticians are struggling to explain away. Let's talk about the bankruptcy wave, because layoffs and bankruptcies are two sides of the same coin, and Russia is currently drowning in both. Russian courts declared 3,750 companies bankrupt in the first half of this year alone, a 10.8% increase over the same period last year, according to data from Fedresors, the country's official bankruptcy registry, as reported by Kommersant. The number of firms entering the first stage of insolvency proceedings, known as supervision, jumped even faster, up 20.9% to 2,170 cases. Moscow itself recorded the highest concentration of bankruptcies had 859 cases, followed by the Moscow region with 260, and St. Petersburg with 232. The Putin region and Sverdlovsk region each saw roughly 120 companies collapse. And crucially, both the bankruptcy total and the supervision totally accelerated sharply in the second quarter of this year compared to the first, meaning this crisis is not stabilizing. It is speeding up. Individual Russians are faring no better. A record 636,000 Russians declared personal bankruptcy in 2025, a 30% jump from the year before and more than triple the roughly 197,000 recorded back in 2021 before the full-scale invasion even began. That trend has continued straight into this year, with personal bankruptcies rising 13.7% year-on-year in the first quarter alone to 137,500 cases. More than 13 million Russians, according to central bank data, have taken out at least 3 simultaneous loans, encouraged by state programs designed to keep consumer spending afloat during the war. Overdue debt on unsecured personal loans has now surpassed 1.65 trillion rubles. One Russian macroeconomist described it, Pravda Ru, as a classic debt pyramid operating at the level of individual households, where people borrowed to repay previous loans for years. And now that the labor market is shrinking and wages have stopped rising fast enough to keep pace, those pyramids are simply collapsing across the country all at once. And behind the personal bankruptcy numbers sits something even more unsettling for the Kremlin, because it's not just households and struggling firms disappearing. It's the entire ecosystem of small and medium businesses that keeps a modern economy functioning day to day. Sberbank's own analysts recently concluded that Russian enterprises have entered what they called the country's first full-scale demographic crisis, borrowing language usually reserved for describing a shrinking, aging population, and applying it instead to the business sector itself. In previous years, most company closures on record were essentially administrative housekeeping, inactive shell firms being cleared out during routine government registry cleanups. This year, closures tied to genuine business decisions jumped from around 5,000 per month to somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 per month. New company registrations, meanwhile, fell from roughly 80,000 during the same period last year down to about 62,000 between January and May of this year. By May, for every 1,000 active firms in the country, there were 4.3 new population. Here's where it gets genuinely dangerous for the financial system as a whole, because all of this converges on Russia's banks. A confidential intelligence memo prepared by a European government, titled quite bluntly, "Note on the probability of a banking crisis in Russia in 2026," and later seen by Reuters, warned that Russia's state-backed lending programs, the subsidized loans handed out to defense contractors and homebuyers to keep the war economy humming, have created what the report called the illusion of a dynamic economy, while actually concealing an explosive underlying situation. Banks were pushed by the Kremlin to waive normal credit checks in order to keep money flowing to favored sectors. And now those same banks are sitting on a growing pile of loans that may never be repaid. Central bank data shows nearly 10% of Russia's microenterprises, firms with fewer than 15 employees, experienced serious difficulty repaying loans over the past year, compared with roughly 6% of small businesses. Non-performing corporate loans across the banking system have reached roughly 10%. That's some of the country's largest banks. Non-performing retail loans hit as high as 15% last year. Ordinary depositors are starting to notice, and they're reacting the way people in any country react when they sense a bank might not be safe. They're pulling their money out. By early August, cash withdrawals since the start of the year had reached an estimated $25.2 billion, according to Sberbank's own vice president and chief financial officer, who also confirmed the bank had already fielded around 300 requests for loan restructuring from businesses damaged by Ukrainian drone strikes on logistics infrastructure, describing the financial damage to online marketplaces alone as, in his words, quite significant. Sberbank, the largest and most systemically important bank in the country, has now cut its own 2026 GDP growth forecast down to a range of 0 to 0.5%, a essentially predicting outright stagnation for the year. It's worth putting this in a bit of historical context, because Russia has been through industrial pain before, and the comparison is not flattering to the Kremlin's current messaging. During the chaotic transition years of the 1990s, mass factory closures became a defining trauma for an entire generation of Russian workers, one the government has spent 2.5 decades promising never to repeat. Putin's entire domestic legitimacy was built substantially on the idea that he, unlike the chaos of the Yeltsin years, could guarantee ordinary Russians a stable job and a predictable paycheck. That was the implicit bargain. Quiet obedience in exchange for order and security. What's happening in Toyati, in the Brezhnev China, where Kamaz is based, just disguised behind bureaucratic language like corporate leave and modernization schedules rather than the word collapse. The Kremlin can control state television. It has a much harder time controlling what happens when a family in a single industry town realizes the factory paycheck simply isn't the same size it was 2 years ago and isn't coming as reliably as it used to. So what does Vladimir Putin's government actually do about all of this? On paper, the honest answer is very little, and the reason traces straight back to the federal budget. Treasury expenditures during the first financial quarter of this year exceeded revenues by $61 billion, coming in 21% higher than the deficit the government itself had originally planned for the entire year. Across the first half of 2026, that budget deficit reached nearly 6 trillion rubles, or roughly $77.4 billion, driven overwhelmingly by record military spending that shows no sign of slowing, with oil and gas revenues down more than 25% due to a stronger ruble and falling global prices, and with import tax receipts also sliding. Moscow simply does not have the fiscal room to bail out its own industrial base the way it might have in an earlier, wealthier era of the war. Instead, the state, has been quietly cutting its own payroll, which is perhaps the most revealing detail in this entire story. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, arguably the most powerful municipal official in the country, and a man usually careful never to contradict the Kremlin's line, announced a planned 15% cut to the number of employees working in the city administration and its subordinate institutions. He attributed the decision directly to a slowdown in budget revenue growth, noting that in January and February of this year, revenue grew by just 2% against an expected 6.5%. If the mayor of Moscow, sitting on the single wealthiest municipal budget in the entire country, is forced to shrink his own bureaucracy because the money simply isn't arriving fast enough, that tells you something about how thin the cushion has become everywhere else. 11 regions have already had to delay paying school teacher salaries because of budget shortfalls, hitting teachers in Chelyabinsk, Irkutsk, Rostov, Arkhangelsk, Tambov, Ryazan, Khabarovsk, Zabaikalsky Krai, Karelia, Udmurtia, and Tuva. As of late February this year, roughly 300 companies across Russia were actively preparing to close their doors entirely, and for the first time in the country's recorded history, 74 out of Russia's regions found themselves in genuine financial distress simultaneously. Rostat itself acknowledged that more than 17,000 Russian enterprises reported outright losses. There's a bitter irony sitting underneath all of this, and it's worth spelling out clearly, because it's the part the Kremlin absolutely cannot spin. Russia does not actually have too many workers looking for jobs. It has, by nearly every measure available, too few. The country's central bank, Governor Elvira Nabiulina, has publicly stated that Russia's labor shortage is more severe now than at any point in the country's modern history. The available labor reserve, essentially the pool of working-age people not currently employed but theoretically available to work, has collapsed by 2.5 million people since the 2022 invasion began, with defense plants, frontline casualties, emigration, and long-term demographic decline all drawing from the exact same shrinking pool simultaneously. As a share of the total employed population, and that reserve has slid from 10% down to just 6%. In 2025 alone, another 415,000 workers vanished from the available pool. And Rostat now forecasts the workforce will shrink by a further 1.4 million people during 2026. Industry analysts estimate Russia will need to replace roughly 2 million workers every single year through 2030 just to keep existing operations running at current levels, a target virtually nobody believes is achievable given current trends. The World Bank has calculated that Russia would need sustained productivity growth of 3 to 4% annually to close that gap through efficiency alone, a rate the country has essentially never managed to hit, even in its strongest economic years. So how do you reconcile a labor shortage this severe with mass layoffs happening at the exact same time? This is the part that actually explains everything, and it's the reason this crisis is so much more dangerous than a normal recession. It is not that Russia lacks jobs. It's that the jobs available are increasingly the wrong jobs in the wrong places, paying wages that no longer keep pace with inflation. Nominal wage growth collapsed to just 8% year-on-year in February of this year, down sharply from 15.1% in January and from an average of 13.5% across all of last year. Once you strip out inflation, that collapse effectively means real incomes for millions of Russian workers have frozen in place or gone backward, even in a supposedly tight labor market. Skilled technicians laid off from Avtovaz cannot simply walk across town into an equally skilled, equally paid position, because the equally skilled positions largely don't exist outside the defense sector anymore, and the defense sector cannot absorb every displaced worker from every collapsing civilian industry at once. What you get instead is a labor market that looks statistically tight on paper, with a headline unemployment rate near record lows, while functioning underneath as something closer to a slow-motion downgrade for an entire generation of industrial workers, pushed out of stable factory jobs and into gig work, delivery driving, or unemployment disguised as furlough. None of this is happening in isolation from the war itself. That connection is really the whole point. Every one of these pressures, the interest rate squeeze, the labor shortage, the collapsing civilian industrial output, the banking strain, traces back to the same root cause. Russia is trying to run a full wartime economy and a functioning civilian economy on the same shrinking base of workers, capital, and government revenue. And something has to give. Right now, what's giving is the civilian side. Industrial production, excluding defense-related sectors, fell 2% over the winter months, according to the CMASF think tank, with February output sitting just 1.1% above the average monthly level recorded back in 2021, the lowest reading since March of 2023. Out of 28 industrial sectors that Rostat tracks on a monthly basis, 22 posted outright declines during January and February of this year. Metallurgical plants saw output fall 15%. Food production dropped 2%. Clothing and footwear manufacturing fell by 11.1%. Even sectors directly tied to the war effort weren't immune, with the category Rostat classifies as finished metal products, which includes things like bombs and artillery shells, actually slipping 1.9% year on year, a signal that even military production is starting to feel the strain of the same labor and supply constraints choking everything else. Adding another layer of pain on top of all this is the fuel crisis running in parallel, driven largely by sustained Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries. Refined petroleum output fell 13.5% year on year in May, and by June, that decline had accelerated dramatically to a drop of 21.8%, according to Rostat's own data, the worst monthly figure recorded in recent years. Overall industrial production declined 0.7% in May alone. Analysts at Pромsvязbank abandoned their previous forecast of 0.6% GDP growth for the year entirely. Now projecting flat stagnation instead, they cut their 2027 growth forecast as well, warning explicitly of the risk that Russia could become trapped in a prolonged, multi-year period of stagnation. Their leading indicators pointed to a high probability that the broader economy would tip into formal recession no later than July of this year, with the downturn likely to last well over a year once it begins. Even Russia's own official statistics have become a source of internal controversy, which tells you just how uncomfortable this picture has become for people inside the system.